afternoon. I'm Ron Eaglin, President of Morehead State University. I am pleased today to welcome each of you in the audience and those watching on KET Star Channel to this opening session of our 7-part symposium on the future of teacher education. Among the special guests with us today is a person who will be on this stage next week for the second session. Please greet the President of the Kentucky Council on Post-Secondary Education, Dr. Gordon Davies. We are grateful to the members of the University Teachers Education Council who are sponsoring the symposium in an effort to gather information on this vital subject which affects every citizen in our Commonwealth. Morehead State University has been training teachers for 111 years, and we are proud of our alumni out there in America's classrooms. Our teacher education program has the highest accreditation possible, and we believe that we have a great faculty members who are teaching tomorrow's teachers. So why are we here? It is the top of our agenda because we realize that today's teachers are facing very different challenges than those who entered the field just a few years ago. I'm very proud that almost 50 of our faculty members from a variety of academic fields are here today and will attend each session as part of their commitment to educate themselves on this important topic. We are seeking information and ideas on the national, state, and local levels because it's important to make informed decisions. We are appreciative of those faculty and staff members who are serving on the steering committee for this series of programs. Please join us in saying thank you for their efforts, and I would ask them to please stand. They're all here in the first row. Stand up and let your colleagues thank you for the hard work that you're putting in. At this time, I am pleased to ask Karen Hammonds, Assistant Professor of Education and Chair of the Teacher Education Council, to introduce our guest presenter.
Thank you, President Eaglin. On behalf of Morehead State University's Teacher Education Council, I am pleased today to have the honor of introducing our presenter. Raised on a farm in North Dakota, he became educated at Iowa State University, UCLA, and the University of California at Berkeley, with each of his degrees in physics. He was a faculty member and administrator at the University of Pennsylvania for more than 20 years and also served 2 years as Deputy Director and Interim Director of the National Science Foundation. He was Chancellor of the University of Illinois at Chicago for 7 years before assuming his current position as Chancellor of the University System of Maryland. The system includes 11 degree-granting institutions and 2 research and service units. Honored for his work in research and teaching, he is the author of more than 100 books, 100 papers and articles, and has edited several books. He is past president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the National Association of State Universities and Land-Grant Colleges, and the American Physical Society. He currently serves as president of the National Association of System Heads and is recognized as an authority on K-16 partnerships and teacher education. Please join us in welcoming the Chancellor of the University System of Maryland, Dr. Donald Langenberg.
Karen, thank you for that very kind introduction. I just wish my wife could have been here to hear it. And President Eaglin, thank you so much for inviting me to be here as part of an activity that I think will be of great importance both to Morehead State and to the state of Kentucky. I should explain a little bit about why I am here. I've national trends and issues in the reform of elementary and secondary education and to talk about K through 16 partnerships. I should hasten to say that I'm really going to be talking about my view of national trends and issues. I do have a view, but it's not necessarily the same as everybody else's in this very important business. K-16 partnerships, on which I really want to focus my remarks, have begun to arise in a number of states over the past few years. We have one in Maryland. I was instrumental in help getting it started. So I should explain what it is. It is at the most superficial level a partnership between the elementary and secondary schools and the higher education community in Maryland. Going a bit beyond that, it is led by a council, a volunteer council, chaired by the state superintendent of education, the state's higher education executive officer, and by me as CEO of the state's system of higher education. That gives it a statewide perspective and a statewide reach. And that, I think, is one of the major strengths of these K-16 partnerships. That strength, the importance of that strength, results from the observation of the nature of the problem we are trying to address. Everyone knows that many of our elementary and secondary schools, many will generalize and say our elementary and secondary school systems are not performing as we would like them to. There is a great deal of criticism of the performance levels of our graduates, our high school graduates, some from employers who employ them after graduation, some from within our own higher education community who receive them as freshmen in our colleges and universities. This is not a problem with a few schools in a few places. This is a problem which appears to be widespread nationally. It's a problem of national scale. It really needs to be dealt with nationally, but in this country we have a very strong tradition that education is primarily a matter for our states. And so therefore, we can get a good deal of help and assistance from our federal government. This is not the government. The national organization is not the way to address this problem. This needs to be addressed on the state level. But if it is addressed on the state level, it needs to be addressed on a statewide basis, because that's the scale of the problem. These K-16 partnerships are based on the notion that elementary and secondary schools, where the initial focus of attention often is, must have help and assistance of higher education if they are to solve their problems. And the principal reason for that is that teachers and their characteristics, their qualifications, their ability to teach in the modern classroom are far and away the most important factor in determining the performance of both elementary and secondary schools and their graduates. But one of the things you understand fairly quickly when you put together a K-16 partnership, that this is really not about higher education helping their lesser colleagues in what I suppose would have to be called lower education. I hate the term higher education. I'm going to try to stop using it right now and talk about post-secondary, because it inserts a notion into this enterprise that really shouldn't be there, and that is that some of us are higher, some of us are better than others. It's very important that in these partnerships one understands that we're all in this together, that the problems that we do have in elementary and secondary schools, problems that we have with performance levels of their graduates, are our problems, not their problems. And that our task is not to help them solve their problems, but to work with them to solve our problems. One also discovers rapidly that if we think they've got problems in elementary and secondary schools, you ought to see ours. And how does one cover that? Well, you begin with the observation that it is the quality and the characteristics of teachers that are of paramount importance. And then you begin to look at the teachers that are in the schools in service and the teachers that are coming into the schools out of our colleges and universities, and you discover that many of them, too many of them, are also not up to the task. And it does not take long to reach the conclusion that we've got some major improvements to make in our teacher education efforts. Radical reform is more like it. Radical and, I must confess, somewhat uncomfortable and to many unwelcome reform, but the need is there. So we are really in this together in lots of ways. Elementary and secondary schools cannot meet their challenges without our help, and we can't meet our challenges without theirs. We really can't. We can't do this on our own. Now, I said a little bit earlier that this is, although a national problem, is not something you can deal with on a national level, and that's true. But in fact, it needs to be dealt with state by state on a national level. And so some of us have been trying to spread the movement through what might be called, I suppose, missionary activity. That is to say, to try to induce the creation in many states of something equivalent to a K through 16 partnership. An effort with organizations, with mechanisms that will differ from state to state, but one in each state is dedicated to that same concept of the elementary, secondary, and post-secondary education systems being part of one indivisible, seamless fabric that has some serious patchwork to be done on it, some rents that need to be fixed, and that we've all got to get at doing that. Karen indicated that I was currently president of an organization called the National Association of System Heads. Those of you who are in higher education probably thought you knew about every single higher education association, and there are literally hundreds of them. But I suspect many of you have never heard of that one, and that's just the way we like it. This is I have called it a stealth association. It has only 52 possible members. There are 52 systems as we define them in the United States and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. This is an association that has no headquarters, it has no staff, it has no mailing address other than its current president's. It doesn't have much in the way of a bank account, but it does have some very useful activities. One of those includes the heads of these systems talking to each other, helping support one another, sharing war stories, and providing, if you like, continuing education for one another. Another has become the K through 12 movement, the K through 16 movement rather, because this is a natural thing for a statewide or near statewide system of institutions that truly are organized as a system to join together with the elementary and secondary school system in this kind of cooperative activity. So we've begun to try to nucleate this kind of thing in one state after another so that eventually we hope we can in fact reach across the country. There is another reason for that, and that is that this kind of effort can easily fail in any one state. I think everybody here appreciates that every state has its own special circumstances, that education, although a matter of great import and of great technical complexity. It's also a matter of great ideological and political interest. And very often, arguments about education get shifted from what is known and what can be done to what should be accomplished politically for one reason or another. The life of a state higher education official or of a state elementary and secondary official is, shall we say, a fairly tenuous one. And it is quite possible to imagine generating a wonderful K through 16 partnership in a state that will depend upon the presence of a few leaders in that state, and you may well find that for one reason or another those few leaders aren't there in that state after a few years. Now, I learned in my career as an experimental physicist that if you want to assure success, that is to say, if you want something to write your dissertation about or to get a Nobel Prize for, your experiments have got to work. Failed experiments are wonderful learning things. People tend not to get dissertations or Nobel Prizes for failed experiments. So the way you maximize your chances is not to have just one experiment running, because about 90% of all the experiments I ever did failed, but to run a whole bunch of them at one time. And that improves your chances that somewhere, somehow, there's going to be at least one success. And in a sense, that's really what we're trying to do in spreading this across the country. I very much hope that Kentucky, under the leadership of this institution, and with the involvement and collaboration of all of the statewide leaders that will be required if you're to have such an effort, I very much hope Kentucky will join this enormously important but somewhat risky enterprise. Why do we care about this sort of thing? Well, it's been about a decade and a half since the Coleman report that was called A Nation at Risk was published, and ever since, somewhat sporadically I would say, there has been an ongoing concern about the reform of American education. But more recently, the need appears to have become a little more intense. Secretary of Education Richard Riley, has pointed out that by the year 2006, that's only 7 years from now, our public schools nationally will have to hire 2.2 million new teachers. And our present production rates are about half that. If something isn't done, we're going to be short about 1 million teachers in this country. That's about the quantity of teachers. We mustn't forget the quality of teachers. There's clear and growing evidence that the largest single factor in the determination of the performance of elementary and secondary students and of our high school graduates is teacher quality. Teacher quality above everything else. Economic status, ethnic or racial identity, everything else. And that means for teachers both content knowledge and pedagogical strategies and methodologies. I think it's fair to say that making sure that that next generation of teachers is good, really good, and that there are enough of them to meet our national needs is probably the single greatest challenge that we in higher education face. Now please note, and I'll emphasize this point again as I go along, we in higher education, that means all of us. It does not mean our schools of education. We very frequently in higher education say, it's really terrible about these freshmen who are coming in out of our high schools. They can't read, they can't count. Isn't it awful? And it's very common to say, but that's not our problem. It's their problem. It's also very common to say, gee, you know, it's really terrible that it appears that some of our teachers, including those graduating from our university, aren't really quite up to snuff. Many of you are aware of what might be referred to as the great Massachusetts teachers' exam fiasco of last summer. But it's also very common for those of us in fields other than education to say, but then of course that's not our problem. That's theirs over in the School of Education. They're responsible for training teachers. Not so. One of the points I want to make this afternoon is that just as it takes a whole village to raise a child, it takes a whole university to make a teacher, and that the arts and science faculty, particularly of every college and university, are just as responsible and should be just as accountable for the quality of the teachers coming out of that institution as are the faculty of the School of Education. They have got to work together to ensure that quality. As I said, that quality is really not what it ought to be. I'll just give you a few data points. 12% of all newly hired teachers in the United States enter their teaching careers with no training to be teachers other than a bachelor's degree. An additional 15% enter teaching without having fully met state standards. And I think most of you probably would agree that the standards in some states are not terribly high. Only 500 of the nation's 1,200 schools of education meet common professional standards. 36%, more than a third of all public school teachers have had neither a major nor a minor in college in the subject that they are now teaching. They may be certified to teach, but not to certify, but are not qualified or are not sufficiently qualified to teach what they are teaching. 6.5% of our teachers come with emergency credentials. The situation is really worse than that, because if you look a little further, you find that the situation is worst where the students need it most. It's becoming abundantly clear through solid research that one of the reasons that students from rural and urban inner city schools, students who come from underprivileged backgrounds, students who typically perform significantly less well on standard performance tests than students from more affluent schools, perform less well because their teachers are less well prepared. Our school systems almost uniformly across the country tend to operate in ways that place the least qualified teachers in the schools where the most needy students are. It's almost as if, and you will find me making analogies to the medical profession once in a while this afternoon, it's almost as if in our hospitals we said, all right, in the emergency room, in the part where all you do is to put on Band-Aids and splint up minor bone breaks, you put your most highly educated and trained brain surgeons. And up in the intensive care unit, or the operating room, you take the least qualified and least experienced physicians you have, and you assign them there. Does that make any sense? No. But we do the analog of that all too often in our schools. Teachers coming in with emergency credentials are typically at a proportion of about 10% in urban areas, and in districts where there are 50% or more minorities, it rises to 14%. We in higher education fret a lot about the remediation problem. And nationwide, about 41% of students enrolled in two-year colleges require some remediation, and it's about 22% of students in four-year courses. up to and including the Ivies. So we've got lots of problems. And you can ask, where does the problem lie? I've already identified that. The major place to put our efforts, I think, is teachers. And that evidence is beginning to come in from a variety of places. Bill Sanders, whose Value-Added Research and Assessment Center just across the border in Tennessee, offers compelling evidence of significant gains in student achievement that are much higher for those students who have had effective teachers. From Texas, from Dallas, come findings that support that and then that also demonstrate dramatically how students lose ground if they are assigned to ineffective teachers. And that effect is rather striking. The difference between a good teacher and a poor teacher can be 1 year grade level difference in performance. 1 year with a poor teacher can cause serious problems for a student. 3 years, 3 successive years with poor teachers cause irremediable problems, problems you can't fix thereafter, no matter how good the teachers are. What does the research suggest about what makes a teacher effective? Well, this is one of those cases where the results are not surprising. Good verbal and math skills, good content knowledge, and good pedagogical skills. We would prefer in higher education, I think, if you grant the necessity of reform, that reform come from within our institutions and within our colleges of education. But there seems to be a certain inertia about reforms being initiated from within institutions and within our colleges of education. And so the call is coming more and more from the outside, from legislatures, from governors, and from statewide business groups, and from higher education and elementary and secondary education leaders. And that call is really for systemic reform. It goes back to the scale issue that I talked about a little bit earlier, reform of the entire system. There's a strong feeling that we've got to fix the whole system, that individual projects, individual model projects won't do. Now, all of us academics are used to, familiar with small projects that a faculty member or a group of faculty members will take on. They may be a project involving research or working with teachers in a local school. They may be a project in nuclear physics. They may be a project in history. Usually it's a small project that goes on for a few years, is done by a couple of people, and almost always in the proposal and in the report that comes out afterward is described as a model for all of higher education. And often they are. But have you ever noticed how rarely these models get picked up and actually spread across higher education? And there's a feeling that despite the fact that an awful lot of good work has gone on in a lot of different places, often involving partnerships between the schools and colleges and universities, that we really got to have system-wide reform. As one person put it, we've got lots and lots of programs in this business. We don't have any system. There are a number of policy groups that are advocating alternative funding methods that would somehow recognize this need, promote flexible personnel practices, program improvements. State agencies are calling often for complete redesigns of current programs. Thinking about multiple paths to certification is also becoming popular, and that goes back to the issue of where we are going to get 2 million teachers out of schools that are schools of education and conventional paths to certification that are now producing about half that number. New models of teacher education include extended internships, professional development schools that are a bit like the old lab schools. This is something we're doing in Maryland, and a lot more careful attention to mentoring during that critical induction period in which the teacher makes the transition from the academic world to the real world. We have particular critical shortages in several key areas: math, science, special education, computer science, and we've got to pay a special attention to those. And there, our needs are perhaps among the greatest. Some of you are familiar with the American Association for the Advancement of Science's 2061 program, which, among other things, has set forth a set of what average Americans, what every American should know about math and science at various stages in their lives. Recently, they have taken a look at what typical Americans do know, in particular those typical Americans who enter our colleges as freshmen. And what they find is discouraging. I would say it's downright bad news. What they find is that the knowledge of our freshmen is typically at about the 6th to 8th grade level. That's the bad news. The really bad news is that when they've been with us through their baccalaureate years and graduate from our colleges and universities, it's still at the 6th to 8th grade level. Now, the first point is, I would say, an indictment of our elementary and secondary schools, and they ought to do something about it, right? Who do you think the second point is an indictment of? Well, you're looking at one of them, me. It's my fault. And I'm looking at a whole bunch of them, you. It's your fault. And we've got to do something about that. Let me say just a few things about some of our experiences in Maryland as we have put together our K through 16 partnership activities. We have a council that kind of oversees the whole thing, but the important part is a working group or groups of probably 200, mostly faculty from elementary, secondary, and post-secondary schools. The very first task they took on was the establishment of the agreement about the core learning goals, the standards, if you will, for an upcoming high-stakes high school assessment program that's being developed, which in the end will determine to some degree who graduates from high school and under what circumstances. It was really kind of interesting. The English folks got together and came to consensus pretty quickly. These were English faculty from the high schools, 2-year and 4-year institution composition directors, and they focused their activities on figuring out what a C paper looks like. They spent about a year on it. They've all agreed on a set of standards for what a C paper looks like, and they have agreed to disseminate the same standards to all students in high school in the 2-year, that is to say the community colleges and the 4-year colleges. And they all seem to be on the same wavelength. Now the English faculty, as these were the writing folks, but the English faculty more generally at our colleges and universities learned that they needed to include some new categories in language awareness in their courses after reviewing the high school graduation requirements. Do we have any mathematicians here in the room? I'm sorry, sir. Colleagues, mathematicians were a real problem. They got together and they could not reach consensus. They reached an impasse. And the basic problem was that between what the college and university math faculty said was absolutely essential for a student coming out of high school before they got to college, and between what the high school teachers said was practical to teach high school kids, there was a gap of about a year. It got called the Algebra 2 gap because that was basically where it was kind of centered, although it didn't necessarily mean the real material that appears in actual Algebra 2 course. So they couldn't agree. But the impasse, they turned away from the impasse and moved toward a course that may lead us to some kind of resolution, because what they have been working on now for about a year and a half is the design of a wholly new course intended for high school that they call the bridge course, that's intended to bridge that gap. And my personal opinion is it'll be something very different from the Algebra 2s that you and I took in high school, but it will in fact bridge that gap. In all of this, it's become very clear that this K through 16 partnership depends very heavily on the work of our arts and science faculty, not just faculty from the schools of education. And indeed, it's been dedicated mathematicians in our mathematics department that have worked very hard to bridge that gap that I just referred to. It's been English and social science faculty that have taken the lead often in settling the core learning goals in those areas. They've got to be such good friends with their counterparts in the elementary and secondary schools that it is very clear that they are now willing to, or at least beginning to accept responsibility for teacher education in our universities. Now that's really kind of a no-brainer. I mean, it's been true for a long time that our teacher education majors got a large part of their general education in the School of Arts and Sciences or equivalent. So it would seem like a no-brainer to say that those faculty need to take responsibility for the general knowledge of the teachers who graduate from the university. Like a lot of no-brainers, that just hasn't happened in the past. We think it's beginning to happen. One of the things that we have been doing with the National Association of System Heads is gathering together every summer as many of our system heads as can come, provided they bring their state superintendents of education and provided they bring their state higher education executive officer, if they have one. Just the CEOs, so to speak. And for the last 2 summers, we have had a couple of wonderful days in each summer in which we really sat down and talked turkey to one another about the issues that confront us, some of which I have talked about, but more important, what we are going to do about them. And that's the note I would like to end on. We in higher education are very fond of discussing issues, of having a seminar or a conference. We're often a little short on deciding that what we have learned in this seminar or conference we are going to go out tomorrow and do something about in our own classrooms, in our own institutions. And it is our collective view, the folks who have attended these summer NASH meetings, that the situation is urgent, possibly even critical, but certainly urgent, and we have got to get down to doing something about it. The colleagues who were at that meeting last summer came up with a mnemonic aid, you might call it, which we call the K through 16 square. It became clear that we had been talking about 3 interrelated commitments that we all had. And it then became clear that there was one more that was needed to fill in the set. We had 4 symmetrical commitments which you could identify with the four corners of a square. And those commitments are as follows. 2 of them are about students, 2 of them are about teachers, 2 of them, another pair, apply to things that K through 12 is mainly going to do, and the other 2 deal with things that we in higher education are going to do. And the commitments are these. We will ensure that all high school graduates meet high standards. There are a couple of very important words there. One is high standards, and we do mean high. Standards that really are at the level that we traditionally have expected only of students planning to attend a university. Such standards for all students, all. There's a simple reason for the all, and that is that our economy is changing very rapidly. It's changing faster than our educational institutions are. And it's changing in a direction that will require essentially all members of our society to have rather high cognitive capability levels. In 1950, about 2/3 of all American jobs did not require a college education at some level, at least a community college associate's degree. That number is now down to about 10%, and is getting smaller all the time. I've been told by a gentleman who's on my business advisory council who runs warehouses in Maryland that what it took once to be a warehouse worker was a strong back and a willingness to work. It then became having the ability to manage a forklift truck. It now means having the ability to manage a fully computerized storage and retrieval system for a warehouse that is as big as a football field or 2 and has no more than 2 or 3 employees in it at any given time. And job after job after job has changed in that way. Commitment B is that we will accept only teachers who can bring all student performance to high standards. And that means not hiring teachers who aren't qualified or uncertified or are underqualified. We can talk about this more in the discussion, but some of you will say, but who's going to be in the classroom? We have to have somebody in the classroom. I want to go back to my medical model. Suppose I were to turn the situation to medicine and say, well, we've got this hospital emergency room, and we really can't find a qualified emergency room physician to serve in the emergency room. But obviously, we've got to have somebody there. So what we'll do is go out and find somebody who has some knowledge of the human body, maybe an unemployed biology major, a retired butcher. We'll give them emergency qualifications, and we'll let them practice medicine in the emergency room. Now, you're all shocked. I hope you're all shocked. We think of doing that. If we did it, there'd be a herd of lawyers on their way to file malpractice suits, and a herd of politicians on their way to pass laws forbidding it. But we do the equivalent all the time in our schools. We are very particular about who, with what training, messes with the bodies of our children and our grandchildren. We really don't seem to care who messes with the minds of our children and our grandchildren. So we need to talk about how we will get to a goal that says we will accept only teachers who can bring all student performance to high standards. And that means students or teachers who actually do that, not who claim they can do that or are certified by our universities to do that, but who actually can do that. Commitment C is we will accept into college only students who meet high standards. If the high schools are going to graduate only students who meet high standards, then that's almost a no-brainer, but that is one way of saying, we're going to work with you. We're not going to do this unilaterally, but remediation and the need for remediation is going to zero. And lastly, commitment D is we will ensure that all teacher candidates we produce are prepared to bring student performance to high standards. That is to say, we're going to help the schools make sure that all their teachers can bring student performance to high standard by not producing any teachers who can't. Now, all four of those things are tough commitments. If they're to be anything more than just words, we've got to do something about them. We are, and the we in this case is, by the way, those who attended the meeting at which these commitments were set forth, but we hope that they will apply to others who will accept these goals, and that in the end the we will include our elementary and secondary and post-secondary school systems, our people, our politicians, and our society. We're not fools. We know that this can't be done overnight. We thought that a reasonable goal was to get those done for perhaps a third of American states. The attentive, the leading, the proactive third by the year 2010. And that the other two-thirds of the lagging states, given the example of the first third, could manage to get it done by the year 2020. I understand 2020 is an important goal here in the state of Kentucky, and I would suggest that you think very hard about joining the National K through 16 crusade, which, by the way, some of us are beginning to refer to as K through gray. But joining the crusade and being among that leading third of the states that make it by the year 2010. With that, Mr. Chairman, I think I will stop, and I'd be happy to respond to questions. Thank you.
Before we proceed to the questions, first let me tell you how to do that. All of you were given a card when you came in. If there is a question that you would like Dr. Langford to answer, if you would fill them out, send them out to the edges, and send them up to the front, and we have persons up here who will gather those and ask those questions for you. Let me say also, some of you have emailed questions ahead of time from the reading material that you received, and I do have the first question, but then I will have none after that point in time. But before we get to that question, let me make a couple of responses and a couple of notes of direction to those of you who have volunteered to be here with all of the presenters. We're very fortunate today to really have a national leader and a national expert in this area. I would hope as you fill out your questions that you keep that in mind, that really we need to really build on his expertise from a national viewpoint. We will have during the symposia many others who will get us down to the local level eventually. Also, I would also remind those of you in the audience, and I do know that we have colleagues at all the other state universities sitting in auditoriums like this watching today, according to their presidents, that we have a goal in mind also. And our goal in mind is to learn as much as we can so that this core group of 50 in May can come together and to spell out the objectives of what we would like to see be accomplished from this experience this semester. So with that in mind, and that really went hand in glove in terms of your action program of trying to get to the highest standards at all levels, I think sometimes what we can do in getting our colleagues involved across the state can move us closer to that direction. Now, with that in mind, I actually have the first question. Based upon your experiences in establishing partnerships between P-12 and higher education or post-secondary education in Maryland, if you could briefly tell us some of the lessons that you've learned in this process and a few things that you might have done differently if you could go back, turn the clock back, and start again. I don't think that was me.
I think I'm going to answer the questions from here. One lesson is that it's very hard work. This really is trying to move a large blob of jello. Everybody's an expert in education, as you all know. Everybody's got ideas. And it is a large enterprise in all states. And you really just have to get people who are committed to spending enormous amounts of time and emotional capital. They exist, however. We've learned that. We have extraordinary faculty members who have gotten so caught up in this that they go around in a state of what appears to be near euphoria, leavened sometimes with a good deal of frustration, and are making it work. A second lesson we've learned, I think, is that there is extraordinary power in ordinary human interactions, if you can make them occur. And this extends from the interactions between university faculty and high school faculty who, for example, when they worked on one of these problems for a while, really do discover that they really are true colleagues, and they become friends. It extends to the three co-chairs who the three of us have worked together enough so that we become good friends. And this is a big surprise to people. Surprisingly, it's a surprise. Couple of examples. We had a visit from a team from a particular state a year or two ago, and they couldn't talk to all three of us at the same time, so they talked to all three of us separately. And I think I was the last, and they were just, we had blown their minds. They said, it's amazing. State Superintendent of Schools knows what your name is. And you know what the State Superintendent of Schools' name is. And we've heard you all talk independently, and you all tell the same story. Incredible. Conversely, sometimes I call fellow system heads in other states to, for example, invite them to one of our summer confabs, and I say, bring along your state superintendent of education, and they say, I wonder who that is. They don't know them, they've never met them, they've never talked to them. That's extraordinary, but it's true. We've become so close that we are beginning to support each other's budgets. My first experience was being invited by Nancy Grasmick, our state superintendent, to participate in her budget hearing. Ours was just, this is before the governor. You know, the governor is sitting there with his staff, and we're presenting our budgets. And ours was, for the university system, was just before that. And after I was finished and we were out, instead of leaving, I went back and sat down in the first row. And all through Nancy Grasmick's presentation, the governor was looking at me kind of strangely, wondering what I was doing there. And then she got to the right point when we were talking about some things we were trying to do jointly, and she invited me to come up and sit next to her, and the governor's jaw dropped. And it dropped even more when I explained that Nancy really needed this money. And he actually asked, well, shall we take it out of your budget? I said, well, I'd rather you didn't, but yeah, for this, you should. What would we do differently? The one thing that really comes to mind is that we should have done earlier something we're now doing and that Georgia did early on, right from the beginning, and that is to found local regional analog councils for the statewide council. This is maybe not so needed in Maryland. We have a population of about 5 million people, and our school districts are our counties. So there are only 24 school districts in Maryland. The state superintendent can sit down around a reasonable sized conference table with every single local school district superintendent in the state. That's a significant advantage. Nevertheless, we've discovered that it's very helpful to get groups of teachers, students, school officials, administrators, and the like, business people and politicians all together in the same room to talk about the issues in a substantive, non-political way. And it's so wonderful now that we've begun to do that. I wish we'd done it a lot earlier.
I wonder if you could answer this question for us. Since higher education was not an active partner in Kentucky's nationally recognized K-12 reform in 1991, what steps would you recommend in the development of a K-16 alignment?
Just insist on elbowing your way to the table, I think. I don't know why it wasn't a partner. I could guess that maybe it was a partner because in a lot of places at a lot of times, folks in one segment, let's say elementary and secondary, just didn't think about higher education except that as kind of an independent place where your students went after they graduated, and vice versa. In higher education, we have a tendency to think of elementary and secondary schools as the place from which our freshmen come and nothing more. Probably nobody called up the presidents of your universities and said, come on in. The presidents probably didn't insist and volunteer and say, we've got to be part of this. You can't do it without us. I think that's really true now. And so I think everybody's got to be aggressively proactive, and if you're not invited to the party, you ought to crash the party. And if the people who are having the party are your old friends and colleagues from the K through 16 partnership, that won't be hard.
You alluded to money earlier. Can you address some of the financial challenges faced by both states and individual institutions in designing and implementing teacher education reform, especially in light of a push for more advanced placement and credit courses and the push distance learning?
Let's see, that's about 3 hours worth. Well, first, there's never enough money to do everything. Secondly, we do spend a lot of money in every state I know on education at all levels. And it's not that we don't have any resources to do these critically important things. But we, I think, increasingly have got to learn to do something that hasn't been very popular in our quarters, where usually the story is, I've got this wonderful new idea, would you give me some money to do it? What we've got to learn to do is to say, this is so important, we're going to do it, and we're going to stop doing something else. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to need new money. We're trying to properly fund professional development schools in Maryland. We're up to about 24. We think we need almost 10 times that many. And that's tough, because you've got, I mean, that really does take new money. But little by little, I think we are going to whittle away at that. You mentioned advanced placements, dual certification. I'm not a teacher educator, and there are a lot of things I am not expert in, but I have this vision, this notion that one of the most important notions in this K through 16 partnership thing is that there ought to be no great divide between high school and college. Advanced placement is really just a way of letting a talented high school student take college courses in high school. But I'm not entirely sure why they have to take it in high school. Why can't they take it in the university? But you say there isn't a university within a mile or two of every high school. No, there's a university potentially, given modern distance learning techniques, in every high school. So the time barriers and the space barriers are beginning to melt away. And ultimately, I think what we need is an education system, a truly seamless system, in which people move in different parts of their education to and through appropriate places at appropriate rates. One could imagine a young person who's particularly adept at mathematics taking advanced calculus from a professor at Caltech, really working to get passable performance in English at his own high school in Kansas City. And because he happens to have a particular bent for languages, taking Mandarin Chinese from a professor in Shanghai, all at the same time. There's no reason why that can't happen, except for a few little modifications in the way our educational organizations are structured.
It seems that unlike prior efforts to initiate educational change, the sense it went too close? Get closer? Okay. The forceful cries from the business world ignited the current movement. Please share your views on this need for K through 16 reform from the world of work perspective.
There is no doubt that the business community in my state, I suspect in yours, is crying rather forcefully. They are not only complaining about deficiencies in the education of people graduating from high school and from college. And by the way, in the latter case, the deficiencies seem to be kind of interesting. By and large, they're not saying they don't know the content of algebra or biology. What they say they don't know is how to work in a smoothly functioning team, how to have strong personal ethical values, because we've got to convince our customer we're honest, how to solve problems, which is an odd term for taking on an issue or a challenge that nobody really knows the answer to, and that usually no one person has the skill to do, and figuring out how to get it done. That's what they complain about. They're also complaining about the fact that the demand for information technology professionals in our area is about twice what all of the institutions in the state of Maryland and Virginia put together produce. And why can't you ramp up production, your production of IT professionals, computer scientists, within a year or two to twice the current level? We're going to do that. It's going to take a little longer than a couple of years for some obvious reasons. But yeah, our clients, the places where our students go to work, the warehouse manager that I just told you about a while back, are getting louder and louder. The economy's good, they're being successful, they can make a whole lot more, they can be a whole lot more successful and make a lot more money if they had better and more staff. One other issue I want to mention is what used to be called, I suppose, continuing education or retraining or something of that sort. This is getting to be a very serious issue. The president of the National Academy of Engineering lately has been reported to have said that the half-life of an engineering education these days is about 5 plus or minus 2.5 years. What that means is that in about the time required to get an engineering education, it loses about half of its functionality. And I very much doubt that other professions are exempt from that. I really do believe that teaching, for example, is at least as hard. I think it's a whole lot harder than engineering, and is moving almost as fast. And I think the matter of continuing education of teachers, in-service training, I guess it's called, needs very, very careful attention. In many other professions, medicine I know is that way, nursing is that way. We've got to find ways to do this, and yes, the money problems will always be with us.
Given all predictions for a mass shortage of well-trained teachers as we enter a new century, how will it be possible to attract both a large number of the teaching profession and also attract much brighter and academically gifted ones?
Very good question. I really don't know the answer, but I would observe two things. One, the number of people in our society who, with respect to content knowledge, are prepared to teach, particularly at, I would say, high school levels and beyond, is really quite large. They haven't been trained to teach for the most part. I'm thinking of people like retired military, people who have retired from other professions, who really do care about education, who care about children, who are willing to take it on. If we could find a way to support them, train them, certify them, I think we could have a major, relatively untapped source of really good teachers. I am not suggesting that they be put in the classroom just to fill the classroom without learning how to teach, although I think there's a pretty good chance that there is more than one person in this room, and I know of one myself, who taught in a university classroom in an Ivy League university for 23 years without ever being taught a thing about how to teach. But that's another story. That's one thing I think we need to look to. As far as the talent, the qualifications of teacher candidate students, it would help a lot if we would double the salaries of American teachers. Most of them are very dedicated people, and they're not in it to make money. They're in it because they love what they do. But when the difference between a Nobel certified software person who gets about $60,000 with about 6 months to a year's worth of training, and a beginning teacher at $25,000 or $30,000 with 4 or 5 years of training gets to be that large. When the difference gets to be that large, it really is ridiculous. One of the reasons we've got that commitment in the K through 16 square about not accepting teachers who cannot bring student performance to high standards is based on a full realization that if we really did that, we'd have a shortage of teachers. And you know what is supposed to happen in free markets when a product is in short supply. The price goes up. Now, I realize there are all kinds of reasons why the market for teachers isn't really a free market. It needs to be a lot freer than it is. But we'd like the price to go up because I think that will make a difference. It should go up.
Is it necessary to replace traditional assessment methods with a standards-based performance assessment?
I think it's probably necessary to replace any assessment measure with a better one. This is, I'm no expert in this field either, but the impression I have is that we have come a pretty long way with the help of good research by a lot of cognitive psychologists and others in assessing some aspects of intellectual capability among human beings of various age groups. I think we're a long way from being able to do what we would like to do, and I think continuing research and continuing improvement in assessment methods is going to be necessary. I do not believe, however, that we can wait for the perfect assessment system. All of standards-based K through 16 reform is based on the notion that once you've got standards, you've got to be able to figure out whether people meet those standards. This applies to teachers just as much as it does to students. And we've got to use what we've got. We've got to make sure it's just as good as it possibly can be, just as objective, just as fair, but then we've got to use it.
The audience is wondering, with states who have undergone K-16 reform, if you could identify a few of those states and allow us to know perhaps if there have been publications of the research on the successful attempts of these states.
There are some. Among the states with which I've had some personal experience that seem to be engaged in things of this sort are, in addition to Maryland, Georgia, very active things going on in Nebraska. California's got some things getting off to a good start. New York. Things look a little different to me in New York and in California. I've begun to wonder whether K through 16 reform as I know it truly is scalable in the sense that I talked about earlier. I'm encouraged by the fact that Kentucky seems to have a population just a little bit smaller than Maryland's. I think something like what I'm familiar with might work here. I'm not sure it'll work in California. I don't know what will work in California. That is a strange and bizarre place. Hope I don't offend any Californians. I got my graduate education wholly in California, and I still believe it's a strange and bizarre place. There are some publications around. I think there are a couple of statements from our little NASH group meetings. There are publications from the Linda Darling Hammond Commission, the National Commission on Teaching in America's Future, which I think are really first-rate. There's a wonderful piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education, the January 22nd issue, by Paul Peterson, I think, from Harvard, which makes a very strong case that what's really needed in education is what we've used in medicine for a long time, randomized field trials to find out what works and what doesn't work. There are a lot of analogies, by the way, between medicine and education. Pardon? Exactly. Well, but think about the difference. At the turn of the century, there was the Flexner Report, done by Abraham Flexner. It was sponsored, I think, by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. And it was that report that changed the previous situation to the current one. It was that report that, in some sense, established the notion that medicine is a science-based profession, that facts matter, and that facts applied to the practice of the profession are important. The previous situation included the fact that there was some belief that physicians were born, not made. We believe that in higher education with respect to professors, by the way. We take new assistant professors, put them in the classroom, give them not a whit of instruction, never demand of them that they know the literature on learning and cognition. We just put them in the classroom and say, teach physics, and they do it the way they were taught physics, and somehow they're supposed to be born or make themselves. Pre-Flexner, the idea was that 6 months or so of training was enough to make a physician. It was rote memorization. If somebody had the croup, you did this, and if somebody had the flu, you did something else. There was strong doubt, very strong doubt among universities about whether medicine was a subject suitable for training in a university. Medicine was one of the lower arts. It was not what places like Harvard did. And post-Flexner, look what's happened, including salaries. Now, if somehow we could professionalize education the way medicine was professionalized, among other things, I think the salaries would follow. But it requires a lot of things, including making facts matter in the classroom. I have a dear friend who's a high school science teacher in Wisconsin, and he once looked me straight in the eye with a bit of sadness and said, teaching is the only profession in which facts simply don't matter. He was at least partly right, I think. Somehow we've got to make it operate kind of like medicine does operate.
How does Maryland address the commitment to accept into college only students who meet high standards? Do you have admission requirements? Do colleges abide by them?
With respect to the last two questions, yes and yes. And the first one is we're not there yet. What the Maryland State Superintendent, what the schools in Maryland are doing is developing now a very high stakes high school assessment instrument that will involve after course examinations in, I think, 10 different broad areas. What has been agreed upon so far is what the areas will be, the fact that the outcome of these examinations will in fact determine in some degree, I like to put it, the conditions under which a student will leave high school. Some might say whether or not they graduate. It's not going to be that simple. And we are struggling on the higher education side to align our admissions with that high stakes assessment. And what that means is not that all of our institutions will have the same admissions requirements. They won't. But the hope is that they will use the outcomes of the assessments to provide a new dimension and perhaps a more accurate reflection of what students actually know and can do than either current high school GPAs or ACT, SAT exams. For Maryland students, it is my fervent hope that that assessment will be so good and will be so predictive that we can just forget about SAT exams. We won't need them. It was really in that sense that I meant the earlier remark about how we've got to make the assessments better. And we're basically trying to make an assessment that is more complete, broader, and better than the SAT exam.
Given that the K-16 square is an admirable and necessary goal, how do we generate the public support to accomplish them without national political leadership?
Any way you can. I mentioned earlier the importance of having local K through 16 groups. I think those are increasingly important because in the end it's the teachers and it's the principals and the local schools that have got to make whatever works work. And you've got to reach them. They've got to be part of the process from the beginning. This is a many years process. We, in our statewide levels, have had a very encouraging degree of buy-in by statewide organizations. There is a business education roundtable in Maryland. They're one of our strongest supporters. When the state school board has had to come to tough decision points in moving toward the high school assessment, remember I said it has been decided that the outcomes of that assessment, yet to be developed, will affect the circumstances under which students leave high school. That was a specific decision that was not an easy one. It was a political decision, and the business community and the higher education community were out in force at the school board meeting at which that happened to make sure that the school board understood that that was the way we all wanted to go. Talking, discussing, helping people understand what really is going on, talking through the issues, but somehow tying it into a real systemic structure is, I think, part and parcel of what has to be done. Are we going to get national political leadership on this? Well, it would be very helpful, I suppose, if President Clinton or President whoever follows him takes this up as a major issue. I think Secretary Riley has been very supportive of this sort of thing. But the fact is that we Americans tend not to national federal government when it comes to education issues. We like the student financial aid they send us, but we don't want them mucking about in our business. And what that really comes down to is that we're all going to have to do it in our states 50 times over, each in our own different way. And one of the things I hope we can do by sort of helping to keep different states connected is to, as states do it in their own way, they can kind of stay in touch with the other folks who are doing it in their own way and compare notes and learn from one another and so forth.
Okay, I know. Resources to an extent determine the type of teachers employed in school districts. How can we evenly distribute resources to ensure hiring better teachers to improve the quality of teaching in our schools?
What a good question. If I knew the answer to that one, I think I could probably get myself elected at least governor. This is a very political issue in every place that I have ever lived. It is complicated by something I said earlier, and that is that there is strong evidence that we send our least qualified teachers to our most needy districts. Part of that has to do with resource distribution. Baltimore City is a typical northern post-industrial city with all of the school system problems that implies. And the tension between the needs of the city, the ability of the state, which provides a considerable part of the budget, and the city itself to fund those needs, and to do that in a way that recognizes the special needs of the students that the city schools serve is not a tension that I can see ever going away. It's just got to be there, but we've got to keep working on that. You know the problem. We have schools in inner city Baltimore where only about 10 to 20% of the kids can pass the current Maryland State Performance Appraisal Program, school performance appraisal program, where exams are given at 3rd, 5th, and 8th grades. And then in Montgomery County, which is the wealthiest of the two counties abutting Washington, D.C., we've got Montgomery Blair High School that just produced, 5 or 6 Westinghouse Science Talent Search finalists. And you won't be surprised to learn that Montgomery County spends more money on Montgomery Blair than Baltimore City spends on the first schools that I mentioned. And somehow we got to find a way to deal with that. I probably don't have any good ideas, but I would suggest one might want to think about redistributing the money, although I know how politically unpopular that is.
See, if universities raise standards and lose students, they are financially penalized by enrollment-based funding formulas. Are other states using funding formulas that reward universities for raising standards, even if it results in lower enrollments? And if so, how?
The connection between enrollment and our funding levels is only partial. We don't have a solely enrollment-based funding formula in Maryland. There is, in fact, a lot of debate at the moment over what our funding model or formula ought to be. But we have stayed strictly away from basing our budgeting for the institutions of the system and our allocations of among them, stayed away from basing them totally on enrollment. There is some reflection of enrollment, but we also depend fairly heavily on looking to see how the Joneses are doing. That is to say, we take our institutions and we take a look at what's going on in other states to see sort of what the market is saying our comparable peer or aspirational peer institutions ought to be doing. And that's one way, I think, of getting away a little bit from the tie to enrollment. Okay. Yeah. By the way, it's not at all obvious that if university raise standards, enrollment will go down. Remember, at the same time, the high school graduates are going to meet higher standards. And one of the reasons for doing this in a partnership is so you can do it together. I mean, the old way, one of the old ways was the higher education community says, we're going to raise standards, so you raise them. You get them passed by the faculty senate, and the president approves them, and that's it. Just send the word out to the schools, we've raised our standards. Tough luck, gang. That doesn't tend to create good feelings. And has been known to bring about retribution from legislatures and things like that. If you can do it together, and if in fact you can raise standards because in fact the students are meeting higher standards, that's the ideal. And getting as close to that ideal as possible is, we think, a good thing.
I think this question is probably a follow-up to that. How did you get the Maryland partnership going, considering that issues in Kentucky are usually begun top-down through legislation?
Well, that happens with us too, but fortunately we had a good idea before the legislature did. That happens fairly frequently, actually. In Georgia, the governor had the good idea and put they call it P through 16 for pre-kindergarten through 16. They have put their system together. It's been very successful. In our case, my recollection is that we thought it up in system headquarters, and I just picked up the phone and called the other two folks and said, wouldn't it be nice if we could do this? And we had some conversations and went out and did it. We're a totally volunteer group. We have no official status. The governor knows we're there, but otherwise has nothing to do with us. And it's kind of like one of those wonderful things like a volunteer fire department.
Let me say one thing about that. I don't know if this mic is on or not. The governor has a tremendous interest in what we're doing here. And he wanted to be here today in person, but his schedule did not allow it. We were unaware at the time we planned this that he was going to create a task force in the state to look at similar issues. Through the leadership of Dr. Davies and Dr. Cody, there are also some other initiatives going on already in math and science. So there has been a history here in various parts of trying to move for better understanding between P through 12 and post-secondary education. The governor has indicated that he is going to attend next week. He's very interested in this, and I think, and Dr. Davies may know more about this than I, but I believe that this governor is willing to let the professionals create the conditions on how to solve long-term issues and problems, and does not necessarily see it as a legislative approach. Also, when we found out that this commission has been appointed, which was today, I think it was announced, but we had the names ahead of time because we called, they are watching somewhere in the state through this program, and staff members who are going to support that effort will be in attendance in future meetings.
It can obviously work either way. Ours seems to work fine as an all-volunteer activity. It does give you a certain amount of flexibility.
Are national accreditation bodies such as NCATE more a part of the problem or the solution to effective preparation of teachers?
I don't know as much as I should know about either NCATE or its new competitor on the horizon. I'd be inclined to think that it may be a little bit of both at the moment, depending upon how progressive they are about switching attention from inputs, how many square feet you've got in your education building and how much money you get, to performance-based accreditation. It's my impression that NCATE is in fact moving toward performance-based accreditation, and I think some kind of standards assessment and performance assessment structures absolutely necessary in our society. I do think that more generally our regional accreditation associations are having a hard time adapting to the new world of higher education, but fundamentally they're things we've got to have. They're us. They're not the Federal Ministry of Education. They're us. They're associations to which we subscribe and that we support, and their purpose is to ensure that we are doing our job properly. And I think they do need to be supported and preserved, but I also think they've got to adapt to the new world, and that's a pretty different world from the one in which many of them have functioned. One obvious evidence of that for the regional accrediting associations is they're regional, and when it's possible for a student in the Middle States region, where I live, to take as easily a course from an institution in Seattle as from one in Maryland, it's not clear to me what regional accreditation really means with respect to that course.
You indicated that education in the U.S. is largely state-controlled. To what extent would we enable progress in various states' experiments if we had strict federal standards as a starting point?
This is just a personal view. Education is a matter for the states. It has traditionally been so. I kind of like it that way. It's chaotic. It's an awful mess. Oh, Lordy, is it a mess. But looking at situations in which there is a federal ministry of something or other. Probably the most strongly centralized version I know is the French version. I'd prefer us. Federal standards, there are efforts, of course, as you know, to establish agreed upon standards at the national level. But I kind of prefer them done by the education community, perhaps approved or blessed by the feds, but one way or another I kind of hate to see the feds ginning up standards for us all to follow. I say that as a former federal bureaucrat, I must say.
To teach many disciplines, a teacher education student completes only 6 to 9 credit hours of substantive coursework. This is true in social science and perhaps other areas. Have you in Maryland addressed this type of multidiscipline certification problem, and if so, how?
I really can't give you a good, solid, reliable answer to that question. I think the answer is, to some extent, yes. There is a trend toward expecting a good deal more content knowledge and a trend toward expecting a more interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary content knowledge, with the emphasis on the pedagogy being shifted to the professional development schools. But that is a kind of a long, it's going to take a while before we get there.
This may be a challenge to answer too. Has your group addressed the question of better preparing regular education teachers for inclusion of students with disabilities in their classrooms? And in parentheses, I wrote, "We do a poor job of this in Kentucky."
There's, at the moment, if I remember correctly, a lawsuit going on over special education in the state of Maryland. And I suspect that's indicative of substantial conflict and probably of some trouble. I don't think I want to go beyond that in my answer, but we've got troubles in Maryland concerning special education.
There's a rising controversy regarding whether physics should now be taught in high school prior to biology and chemistry. What are your thoughts, and what are the consequences for preparing science teachers?
I love that question. Who planted that one? Bottom line is, I'm all for it. Let me explain why. I am as much of a chauvinist as any average physicist, and that's pretty much of a chauvinist. But things have changed since I went to school. When I went to high school, it was like everybody else's high school, I suspect, among the gray-haired ones here. Biology came first, because everybody knew that was easiest. And then chemistry came next. And then physics was an elective. And, you know, the few survivors from chemistry took physics. But in those days, biology, forgive me, wasn't really a science. It was more akin to stamp collecting. It was description. It was description and classification. You learned the organs of the body. You learned that insects were related to other kinds of animals. You learned something about evolution, but I didn't care much for biology when I took it, because you couldn't find the hardcore of real science. Chemistry was more of a science. There were the valence rules and all that sort of thing, but what I came to understand later was, as the beautiful applications of quantum mechanics to truly understanding chemistry just wasn't quite there at the high school level. And then at the end there was physics, and somehow that was supposed to be the hardest. And you kind of worked your way up from simplicity to difficulty. And I never could understand that. Because physics fundamentally is by far the easiest of the sciences, the simplest, the most basic. What's happened in the too many years since I was in high school has made it realistic to contemplate teaching physics first, then chemistry, and then biology, because that is the order of the complexity and difficulty in the real world. It's a lot easier to understand chemistry if you have some sense of physics. And since biology nowadays is all molecular biology and biochemistry, serious, tough stuff, having some knowledge of inorganic chemistry and some physics has got to be helpful. I saw that process about halfway through when I was trying to help my own children get through high school biology, and the book was totally different from my biology book. It had real science in there, and it had real science that was tough to understand without having a PhD in physics from Berkeley. So, yes, I have heard rumors. In fact, I have read on the front page of the New York Times that my good friend and the crazy physicist Leon Letterman is promoting teaching high school science in the order physics, chemistry, biology. I think that's exactly right. That's the way the world is, and that's the way we ought to teach it in high school.
This is a follow-up to your comments on teacher salaries. Are there any initiatives that you know of to increase teacher salaries for science and math teachers where there are long-term shortages?
I really don't know what the situation there is. I think the market works, and it ought to lead to, I think should lead, as it often leads in higher education in fields where there are shortages of faculty, to premium salaries for teachers in fields in short supply.
This is a rather lengthy question, so I'm going to read it off the card. A multiple question, but really one. In references to the K-16 square point C. If colleges accept only students who meet high standards, and the current job market requires more workers with college experience, the pressure on the K-16 square point A becomes more intense. Could you address the practical challenges of assuring that all high school graduates meet high standards? While that's an attractive ideal, wouldn't it imply a need for much more intense developmental or remedial measures for divergent learners in K-12? Why shouldn't post-secondary educators be involved in that as well? Doesn't that imply that higher educators are willing to see only the well patients, a perpetuation of an elitist attitude that already exists?
Stand up.
Well,
Whoever wrote that statement.
This K through 16 partnership bit, remember, does extend back to K and indeed P, and maybe before. And that means the whole thing is part of our challenge in higher education. It has to be. It's part of our challenge in everything from the research that gradually tells us more and more about how human beings learn. Indications, for example, that the brain is actively rewiring itself in the first years, and that the conditions under which it rewires itself are terribly, terribly important. Applying what that means to the way we organize our education for very, very young children, and for dealing with the differences between and among the way people learn. I'm told by people I suspect have reason to know that of all of the many different ways people learn, the one that is least effective, or that works well for the smallest fraction of our species, is lecturing and listening. I know that's the case for most of the people that I spent most of my life with. And we've got to learn how to take that knowledge and the science it's based on and somehow create an education system that tailors learning circumstances to the learners. And I'm thinking in great and glorious ideals is going to be very hard to get to. But somehow we got to recognize the fact that different students, just about everybody, learns in different ways. That there are ways you can find out how someone learns, that you ought to be able to do that at a very early age, like 1 or 2 or 3, and that you got to start then adapting education to those learners. And that in the end, you can in fact bring everybody to perform to high standards. It is possible. One of the reasons we titled last summer's statement with renewed hope and determination, the renewed hope comes from the increasing evidence that here and there around the country, people in fact are making, for example, in whole school systems, the gap between minority and majority students, the performance gap, essentially disappear. It's been done in El Paso, Texas. The minority group in question are Mexican Americans. The problem there is exacerbated by the fact that for many of them, English is a second language. But in a collaboration, a true K through 16 collaboration among the University of Texas, El Paso, the local business community, the local schools, they have materially improved the situation. And they've done it for all students.
Do you have any views as to the proper balance of discipline-specific courses to pedagogical courses in a teacher education curriculum? Are you a proponent on lengthening the time it takes to prepare teachers?
With respect to balance, I have no idea what the proper balance is, but I kind of have a suspicion that it's a mistake to separate content courses from pedagogical courses. Here's what you teach over here, and here's how you teach it here. I'd be inclined to imagine that it would be much better to meld the two. One of the reasons I'm thinking that is the experience now in a couple of other professions, in medicine and in engineering. Most of you are familiar with traditional engineering undergraduate courses in which the first couple of years you get the general education, you take the basic math, you take calculus, you take the basic physics, you take chemistry and so forth. And then long about the end of your sophomore year or your junior year, you start getting to do real engineering, designing things to see if they work. And a lot of engineering schools have now discovered that the reason young men and women decide to become engineers is not because they first want to fail freshman chemistry and then become engineers as a booby prize. They really want to be engineers. And you get much better persistence in engineering, in much better performance, and a lot happier students if the first design course they get is the first semester of their freshman year. Start doing engineering right at the beginning. And then fold in the basic science with the engineering. Medical schools are doing the same thing. They're beginning to connect medical students to patients right in the first year and not waiting. And I think somehow with teachers, we really ought to be doing the same things.
Oh, how long should we take longer to prepare teachers?
Well, we could take shorter, but gee, we got to do what needs to be done. And I guess I'm inclined to think, if I really meant what I said and I did, that teaching is a whole lot harder than doing engineering. I don't see how we can do it in less time than it takes to train an engineer, and that's getting to be 5 years, plus a master's degree.
There's a management rule of thumb that people tend to do what they get rewarded for. Sometimes teacher compensation is associated with student teaching evaluations. And some students would prefer not to read or to do much work outside of class. Should teachers design their courses to satisfy students, or should they do what they think is right and accept the consequences?
Well, ideally, in the scheme that I'm thinking about, you need to design the courses to produce the maximum possible performance of your students as judged by a reliable, fair, and effective assessment system. We focus too much, I believe, on assessing inputs, and student-teacher evaluation is just one form of assessing inputs, assessing what the teacher provided. It tells you nothing about what the student actually learned, knows, and can do. And measuring that is hard, but it's really what we're after. If we really are concerned about the effectiveness of our education system, we ought to be trying to measure what it is we're really trying to produce rather than a whole bunch of inputs and along the way processes. Which is also hard, but we ought to be applying our efforts to that.
What are the three most salient issues relating to teacher education being addressed by K-16 councils?
I can really only speak to Maryland, the K through 16 Council, but also our Council of Deans. And I think among the issues that they are addressing are curricular reform, heading in a direction of looking at teacher performance. They're not there yet, but they're beginning to work on it. An example occurred, by the way, this past year when everybody got concerned about reading. The Baltimore Sun has been running a series since summer, I think, called Reading by 9. Our major city newspaper has at least a page every day devoted to the teaching and the learning of reading. Not bad. It's got people's interest up. And it was, of course, determined that our students weren't performing very well. And so the State Superintendent of Education proposed that we increase the number of courses required for teachers in training, in reading teaching, from 1 to, I think, 4. Our K through 16 partnership, which is co-led by the State Superintendent of Education, basically said, okay, that's okay for the moment, but we've got to have a performance-based system, and it shouldn't matter how many courses a teacher candidate takes in the teaching of reading. What does matter is, can they teach reading? And maybe that takes 1 course, maybe it takes 10, but they've got to demonstrate they can teach reading. So we compromised. Nancy Grasmick got her 4 courses for the moment, but we got a commitment to work on the performance-based assessment of teacher performance in reading, and that's the direction we're headed. Another major issue is how fast and how far we can take the use of professional development schools for all teachers. There is a general commitment to take it to as the clinical experience for all teachers, but we got a long way to go, and the argument's not about whether we should do it, but about how we get it done, because it costs money. A word or two about that group of deans. The dynamics there were really kind of interesting. Our regents, on my recommendation, said we should take a look at our schools of education in the context of the K through 16 partnership. So that we got all the deans together, and the group was chaired by one of our regents. It was kind of an innovation, and you might not want to think about having a member of your board chairing an important committee of deans. Who knows what kind of mischief they would get up to. But this was a wonderful regent. She runs a private school, K through 8, I think. She's just the kind of person you would like to have for your children's kindergarten teacher. Sweet, supportive, warm, kind, tough as nails. And she took a group of deans, many of whom had never met one another, and who for the first several months sat around the table in defensive poses, and somehow managed to get them to coalesce on what amounts to an informal statewide plan for the reform of teacher education, which will come out of the schools of education and will be led by the deans. It is not being imposed by me or the regents or the State Department of Education or whatever. That was the desired outcome, and I think it's going to work.
We're going to end on that positive note. I want to thank Dr. Langenberg for giving of his very, very valuable time to be with here today, and all of you giving of your time. Now we know what it means for students to sit for 2 straight hours. I was kind of twitching. I know you probably were too. We want to invite you to come back next Friday at the same time when Dr. Davies and Dr. Cody of the Kentucky Department of Education will explore this topic at the state level. I would encourage any of you who are in our viewing audience and any of you here, this is our first time through, so if you could email any suggestions on how we might improve or any questions that you might want to have in advance, if you would do that. I bid all of you a good evening from Morehead State University.